Welcome back to Ancient Philosophy. We're on Lecture 9, so we are at the heart of the Republic, books 5 through 7. So this is really where Plato combines his radical politics with some really interesting ideas in metaphysics and epistemology. So let's begin with an overview. So recall that the way we're thinking about the main argument in the Republic, it's an argument for the conclusion that justice in the soul is profitable. Now, as we've seen, there's a lot more going on. Plato is proposing an ideal city in addition to an ideal individual, and there's a lot of interest in the nature of the ideal city, which we'll see as we're getting into the core part of the Republic. In terms of the overall argument, we've seen Plato's reasons for premise 1, that both the individual and the city comprise forces potentially at odds with one another. The city is composed of various parts. The soul, he thinks, is composed of various parts, and these parts can be in tension with one another. For example, with the nature of the soul, as we've seen, it has 3 parts: reason, emotion, and desire. And when reason, emotion, and desire get out of whack, when desire tries to rule, for example, this is a conflict. This conflict needs to be resolved, Plato thinks, in terms of reason's ability to rule. In books 5 through 7, we get, according to Pappus, an argument for the claim that justice consists in harmony among those forces. Now, as we'll see in a bit, there's a lot more going on in books 5 through 7 than just this. A lot of the fascinating ideas that we get in the Republic really are digressions. So Plato's interlocutors will want to know more about Socrates' views about a particular subject, and Socrates, of course, will divulge. As I've said, books 5 through 7, what we get is Plato's radical politics. We're going to see that the ideal city that he is proposing is very different from the Athenian city. And he mixes within these proposals some very distinctive claims about epistemology and metaphysics. So we would begin book 5 with another challenge to the idea that the ideal city is impossible. So Socrates' interlocutors want him to expand upon the nature of the ideal city to show that it's really possible. He's asked to talk about women, marriage and children, and the city as a big fraternity, a big family. So Plato's remarks here on women are very interesting. So the initial challenge that Socrates faces is whether the task for women and men should differ. Women naturally bear children, and so the thought is that perhaps, with the one job principle, that some female jobs would be different from male jobs. Socrates here and Plato interestingly defends the equality of the sexes. So if you look at this passage on 455d, Plato says there, he says, then there's no way of life concerned with the management of a city that belongs to a woman because she's a woman, or to a man because he's a man, but the various natures are distributed in the same way in both creatures. Women share by nature in every way of life just as men do. So now there's some more stuff going on there that you can read. Commentators think that this is in a way an argumentative strategy for Plato to point out that when it comes to the natural task of a city, that both men and women have equal aptitude to the various tasks. So that's really interesting because it goes against, at that time, the widespread view that men and women were unequal and suited for different tasks. So Plato's idea there is that men and women have the same aptitude for the various tasks in the city. This aptitude is distributed in various ways according to individual nature. But the overarching idea is revolutionary at the time, is that Plato is recognizing that insofar as intelligence and insofar as skill matters for the governance of the city, both men and women share equally in that. So Plato thinks that both men and women should be within the guardian right. So the next part is marriage and children. Now this is really a radical proposal. Plato doesn't allow for private families within the ideal city. Plato thinks that private families are a microcosm of the state, and it can produce disorder and disharmony within the state. There are a couple aspects here. I'll let you read those passages, but there are a couple aspects here I wanted to highlight. One is that Plato recommends a fairly widespread eugenics program. So if you look at 459, for example, he says there, do you breed them all alike, or do you try to breed from the best as much as possible? And so they're talking about breeding with dogs, hunting dogs, for example. And do you breed from the youngest to the oldest, from those in prime, from those in prime? And do you think that if they weren't bred in this way, your stock of birds and dogs would get much worse? Oh, I do. What about horses and other animals? Are things any different with them? It would be strange if it were so. Well, this also holds true of human beings. Our need for excellent rulers is indeed extreme. He says it does hold true of them, but what of it? Because our rulers will then have to use a lot of drugs, and while an inferior doctor is adequate for people who are willing to follow a regimen and don't need drugs when drugs are needed, we know that a bolder doctor is required. So he says that our rulers will have to make considerable use of falsehood and deception for the benefit of the city. He says in 459 he says it follows from our previous agreements. First, that the best men must have sex with the best women as frequently as possible, while the opposite is true of the most inferior men and women. And second, that if our herd is to be of the highest possible quality, the former's offspring must be reared, but not the latter's. And this must all be brought about without being noticed by anyone except the rulers, so that our herd of guardians remains as free from dissension as possible. So Plato's here advocating a state-run eugenics program that has a significant amount of deception to it that covers its tracks so that people don't really realize what's going on, but the aim here is to produce ideal citizens for the ideal city. Later, in 461c, Plato recognizes that the older guardians, after they've passed their child-rearing prime, are allowed to copulate as much as they want. And so they ask what happens if some of these arrangements produce a child. And Plato says, well, if they do, the child needs to be exposed. So he says, having received these instructions, they should be very careful not to let a single fetus see the light of day. But if one is conceived and forces its way into the light, they must deal with it in the knowledge that no nurture is available for them. So again, Plato here is recommending state oversight to ensure that, as he's conceiving of it, the best people have the best offspring, and the offspring that isn't from those arrangements has to be dealt with accordingly. In Plato's city, this means that if infirm people have offsprings, the offspring is to be killed. Okay, so moving on to Plato's idea of the city as a big family. Remember, Plato is thinking that private families can be destructive to the city. So he argues in this passage, 462a to 464b, that the greatest good for a city is that which unifies it, and the greatest evil is that which divides it. When all citizens share in the same pleasures and pains, the city is unified. So there's a community spirit that everyone, in a way, endures the same task and shares the same benefits. But when there are private pleasures and pains, the city is divided and civil war results. The third claim here is that the city in which women and children are held in common enjoy the greatest unanimity about pleasures and pain. So Plato's thinking, remember that we're going to get rid of the family, that the couplings that are going to produce children are going to be state-run, in a sense that the women in the state and the men in the state will be resources for the state to use to propagate the ideal state. And so there will be no private families, that the arrangements in a way will be all in the public interest. This gets talked about in the literature as women and children are held in common. And so Plato thinks he has an argument here that the community of women and children among the auxiliaries brings the greatest. So for example, Plato says on 462b, is there any greater evil we can mention for a city than that which tears it apart and makes it many instead of one? Or any greater good than that which binds it together and makes it one? And then over on 464b, you get this claim that we were just talking about. The cause of the greatest good for our city has been shown to be the having of wives and children in common by the auxiliaries. So the next challenge to the possibility of the ideal city is the challenge of the possibility of having good rule. Now Plato is going to argue that good rule depends upon philosopher-kings. It depends upon people in which philosophical training and political training are unified into one. So in this part of the Republic, Plato is going to argue in a two-step fashion. So first, he's going to argue that philosophers are good rulers. And then second, he's going to argue that you need to train the guardians for rule as philosophers. So the guardians, in addition to receiving the education that we've talked about in books 2 and 3, should also receive training in philosophy. And we'll see about this toward the end of the lecture. So here's the argument that philosophers are good rulers. Philosophers love every kind of learning. So this is in 475c. Plato says, "The one who readily and willingly tries all kinds of learning, who turns gladly to learning and is insatiable for it, is rightly called a philosopher." In a way that you can think of it as a definitional move, but as we'll see, what is required for being a philosopher is that a philosopher has knowledge, not opinion, and Plato will give arguments for this. So then he remarks that no one else loves every kind of learning, and these are when we're going to get some of these arguments between the distinction between knowledge and opinion. Third premise is the love of every kind of learning produces ethical knowledge and virtue. So this is the key claim here, that the philosopher is going to have knowledge about ethical matters and the philosopher is going to be virtuous. So you get the conclusion that love of every kind of learning makes one a virtuous. So as we see here, really the key claim is two, that only philosophers love every kind of learning. So Plato wants to turn to an argument to distinguish between knowledge, which is held exclusively by philosophers, and opinion, which is held by the masses. So this is where we're getting some of the most interesting parts of the Republic. Plato here argues that only philosophers have knowledge, that non-philosophers, in virtue of the way that they engage with the world, only have opinion. The passage here begins with a brief discussion on the nature of forms. So I want to highlight three aspects to forms that are highlighted in that passage. I encourage you to go read that passage. So the three aspects of form are uniqueness, self-predication, and non-identity. So the uniqueness of forms. The form of X is the only one of its kind. So when we try to find the form of goodness, we're looking for a single, unique entity. There aren't multiple forms of goodness. Self-predication is the idea that the form of X is the exemplar of the property X. So when you locate the form of goodness is the exemplar also of goodness. So you can say the form of goodness is good, or the form of beautiful is beautiful. And the third feature of forms that comes in this passage is what's known as non-identity. So individual things may share in the form of X, but they are not identical to the form. So individual beautiful things will share in beauty, but they are not the beautiful. Individual good things may share in goodness, but they are not the good. They are not the form of the good. So this account of forms we've seen also in the Phaedo. In the Phaedo, Plato argues that the soul has an affinity to the forms. The soul can grasp the good. The soul can grasp the beautiful. And thus it must have properties similar to the forms. In particular, the soul must be everlasting, must be eternal. Plato is going to proceed here to argue that individuals who rely on sense perception as their source of cognitive contact with the world only have opinion. So the argument is that sense perception puts us in contact with particulars. So we can look at a particular individual, and we might say this individual is good, that the individual shares in the form, the good. But in virtue of the fact that this is an individual, the individual will also have contrary properties. So some of the actions of the individual will not be good. And so there's a way of thinking that this individual is both good and not good. And for Plato, that shows there's something lacking about particulars and lacking about how sensory perception could put us in cognitive contact with objects. So there's a key premise here in Plato's argument, and the idea here is that knowledge of X is possible only if X is unqualifiedly good or unqualifiedly beautiful. So to use another example, if you think of a person and you think, oh, that's a beautiful person, on Plato's view, the person is sharing in the form of beauty. But if you take a picture of them in the morning, then it may be that they're not beautiful. So Plato thinks that you can't have knowledge of this person because they're not unqualifiedly beautiful. They both share in the forms of beauty and ugliness. Now in the background here, this is very reminiscent of Heraclitus's doctrines of the flux and the unity of opposites. So the doctrine of the flux says that objects possessing a given property will come to possess a contrary property. So we've seen this when in the first lecture when we looked at Heraclitus, he's thinking that, a beautiful object will come to be not beautiful, or an object that's hot will come to be cold. And the unity of opposites is the doctrine that every object that has a property also in some respect has the contrary property. So this is where you get Plato's discussion of the double is also half, or the big is also small, or the hot is also cold. The idea here is best understood in terms of comparison terms. So a tall toddler will be very short for an adult, or a short basketball player, a short professional basketball player, will be tall relative to normal adult standards for tallness. So many of these terms, in a way, many of our ordinary terms are relative in that they depend upon a class of individuals that you're comparing them to, and so they illustrate this unity of opposites. Plato here is thinking that true knowledge isn't subject to this unity of opposites, and true knowledge puts us in contact with something that. So we turn now to the metaphysical and epistemological highlight of the Republic. This is a passage, and these are passages that are well worth thinking about over and over and over again. They reflect some of Plato's most considered views on metaphysics and epistemology. So the discussion on the form of the good, remember, is in this context of explaining why the ideal city needs philosopher rulers. Plato thinks here that Plato starts off by talking about a form of the good, which is surprising, so we want to know about this. We're not going to be told a whole lot about the form of the good, but he says that the form of the good is the most important thing to learn about. So we're going to get a series of thought experiments, of allegories, to illustrate the importance of the form of the good. He continues to say that the form of the good is that for which everyone acts. Every soul, he says, pursues the good and does whatever it does for its sake. It divines that the good is something, but is perplexed and cannot adequately grasp what it is or acquire the sort of stable beliefs it has about other things. And so it misses the benefit, if any, that even those other things may give. We will allow the best people in the city to whom we entrust everything. Then he asks, will we allow the best people in the city to whom we entrust everything to be so in the dark about something of this kind and of this importance? And so the idea is no. The rulers of the city need to have this knowledge of the form of the good. This is knowledge that is very difficult to obtain. We'll see this in a bit with Plato's educational plan. He talks about the form of the good by using an analogy with the sun. So the analogy is supposed to go like this. So we think on the one hand the form of the good, and that is supposed to be analogous to the sun. Intelligence is supposed to be analogous to the eye. Knowledge is supposed to be analogous to sight, and the forms are supposed to be analogous to visible objects. So the idea is that the mind has knowledge about the forms. So beauty itself and good itself and all the other things we thereby set down as many. We set down according to a single form of each, believing that there is but one and call it the being of each. So we have these arguments that Plato has been giving us, these discussions about the nature of the forms. And here what we see is that there is a structure in a way to the forms, that there is an overarching form of the good that illuminates the mind to allow it to grasp the particular forms. So let's see what Plato says here towards the end. Okay, so he says, so I'm reading on 508d through 509b. While we understand the soul in the same way, when it focuses on something illuminated by truth and what it understands, knows, and apparently possesses understanding. But when it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity, on what comes to be passes away. It opines and is dimmed, changes its opinions this way and that, and seems bereft of understanding. So Plato's thinking here that the intellect is able to grasp these eternal, unchanging objects and sort of can hold them, and they know that they're not going to shift or change their properties. But this is what he thinks that, as we've seen, that perception does. It gives us objects that properties change over time, and so in a sense, Plato's thinking these aren't true objects. These aren't true things that can be known. So that what gives truth to the things known, and the power to know the knower, is the form of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also the object of knowledge. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. In the visible realm, light and sight are rightly considered sun-like, but it is wrong to think that light and sight are the sun. So here, it is right to think of knowledge and truth as good-like, but wrong to think that either of them is the good, for the good is yet more prized. This is an inconceivably beautiful thing you're talking about, if it provides both knowledge and truth and is superior to them in beauty. You surely don't think like a thing like this could be a pleasure. Aristotle is going to complain that Plato's remarks here are obscure. That is fair. Now, the remarks still are suggestive, and there are different interpretations of how to understand the form of the good. I'm just going to give one, which I think helps illuminate what Plato is after. There's a certain view within medieval philosophy about the nature of God. They think that God is outside of space and time, that God endows everything with the properties that it has, that God creates mathematical truths, God creates abstract truth, that everything, big everything that exists because of the nature and the activity of God. Things have categories because of God's creative activity, but God himself is simple and pure, undifferentiated being that lies in a way outside of the categories of existence. We come to have knowledge in virtue of the activity of God. And it's only those who, after careful study, realize this way in which the divine activity makes knowledge possible, makes objects possible, differentiates individual objects, that you can come to see that underlying it all is God's activity. Now, this interpretation is very much in line with Plato's obscure remarks here about the form of the good. So if it helps, then good. If it doesn't help, then don't worry about it. So Plato provides the following two cases, the divided line and the allegory of cave, to try to illuminate the role of the form of the good and the distinction between knowledge and opinion. So the divided line gives us a division between opinion and intellect. On the one hand, there is the physical world perceived by the senses. This is a realm in which things are subject to Heraclitean flux. Things are in a state of becoming. They have properties and they're changing into contrary properties. Apart from the realm, the physical realm, is the invisible world, the world that has being, that's grasped by the intellect. Now, corresponding to those two distinctions within each category is a further distinction between kinds of cognition. So there is what Plato calls conjecture, which is like shadows. And then there's belief, which grasps physical objects. So conjecture is the weakest form of cognitive contact, or the weakest form of cognition. It's grasping at these shadows, which aren't even real objects within the realm of becoming. Belief is more stable, more permanent. It gets at physical objects, but those physical objects, remember, are still in the subject of Heraclitean flux. In the realm of the intellect, there is a division between understanding and episteme, or knowledge and ideal science. Understanding is illustrated by mathematics. Now, Plato's remarks here on mathematics are curious in a way. Plato's thinking that mathematicians still need to make use of hypotheses. Now, Euclid's Elements were not written when Plato was writing the Republic. It was written after the Republic. So geometry in that time made use of hypotheses. You can think about geometrical theorems, but those theorems would be proven on the basis of axioms or assumptions. Now, Plato is thinking that there's something non-ideal still about that nature of mathematical cognition because it rests on these unproven assumptions. So the classical case of an unproven assumption is Euclid's parallel postulate. So the parallel postulate says that you can take any point, right, that's not on a given line, and there's going to be exactly one line through that point that never intersects with the other line. So this is known as the parallel postulate because you can have just one and only one parallel line that doesn't at all, that goes through a point that's not on the original line. Plato thinks that this is not ideal knowledge would have this axiomatic structure, but the axioms themselves would be known. So the development of non-Euclidean geometries in the 19th century shows that the parallel postulate is not a necessary truth. Plato thinks that philosophy can grasp this ideal knowledge where it arises to the form of the good, and somehow or another the grasp of the form of the good is able to unify knowledge of everything else so that it is a giant, systematic, coherent system with lots of interconnections. And this isn't going to rely on unproven assumptions. Everything within the system is going to be proven, and it's going to proceed from a knowledge of the form of the good. So that's Plato's vision. It's a compelling vision. We'll see how Aristotle works out this vision with his account of scientific knowledge. So let's look at how Plato ends the dividing line here on 5:11. So this then is the kind of thing that, on the one hand, I said is intelligible, on the other hand, is such that the soul is forced to use hypotheses in investigation of it, not traveling up to the first principle, since it cannot reach beyond its hypotheses. So remember the geometry example that I just talked about, but using as images those very things of which images were made in the section below, and which, by comparison to their images, were thought to be clear and valued as such. I understand what you mean by what happens in geometry and related sciences. So here think about, when you're thinking about an ideal triangle, we often use pictures of triangles, but pictures of triangles don't have perfect, interior angles that add to 180 degrees, or a circle, right? A circle is often wobbly when we draw it, but yet it can be used to illustrate, to grasp with the mind the perfect circle. So it continues, then also understand that by the other subsection of the intelligible, I mean that which reason itself grasps by the power of dialectic. It does not consider these hypotheses as first principles, but truly as hypotheses, stepping stones, to take off from, enabling it to reach the unhypothetical first principle of everything. So this is the arc principle that is supposed to organize all other knowledge. Having grasped this principle, it reverses itself, and keeping hold of what follows from it, comes down to a conclusion without making use of anything visible at all, but only of forms themselves, moving on from forms to forms and ending in forms. I understand, if not yet adequately, that you want to distinguish the intelligible part of that which is. So Plato's views there is of a systematic science, systematic knowledge. We use science here in the sense of episteme, that it's an organized, coherent, systematic whole that rests on one sort of uber explanatory principle that can be used to derive everything else. So then we turn to the last example that's supposed to illustrate the form of the good and its function in human knowledge. This is the allegory of the cave, and this is a very famous allegory. I'm sure many of you have heard this already. So Plato here is thinking about the distinction between knowledge and opinion, and he wants to illustrate this by way of a picture, by way of an allegory. So at the lowest level of conjecture, you have individuals who are at the back of the cave, and they are looking at shadows cast on the wall of the cave. Now the shadows are illuminated by a fire in the back, and then you have, almost like a picture screen, you have objects that are going in front of the fire, and so the shadows that the people see are images of objects illuminated by a fake sun, illuminated by a fake source of light, by fire. Now, people at the lowest level of cognition confuse these images that are put on the cave wall for real objects. Now, what happens to a person who has a philosophical bent is that they gradually move. They somehow or another escape their bounds and turn to see the true nature of the illuminated objects. So they come to recognize that the shadows on the walls aren't the real objects, and they see the objects that are illuminated by the fire. There's a moment where they mistake those for real objects. One gradually turns away from various states of opinion, right, to see daylight outside and see real objects in real daylight, and these correspond to the forms. That they're no longer, in a way, grasping the puppet objects that are illuminated by the fire, but now they're grasping real rocks and trees and animals. And this is akin to first knowledge of the forms. And then eventually, with very difficult effort, they can go to grasp, in a way, the sun itself, which is the form of the good. This is the final stage of inquiry. This allegory is used for a number of things. It can be used, it's probably used by Plato in a way as a defense of Socrates, because when a philosopher comes back from the light to try to teach those bound in the cave the true nature of reality, Plato thinks that there's going to be hostility, and these people are going to try to silence the philosopher. This can also be used as an explanation for why Plato thinks that philosophical activity is difficult, challenging, and that it's not going to be successful. So there are a lot of interpretive questions here with the allegory of the cave, and I want you to write about those. This is I think, a really fun analogy to think about in terms of Plato's overall metaphysics and epistemology, and especially over his overall political philosophy. So I will enjoy hearing your thoughts about it. Now we get to the end of Book 7, and we've just had a large digression into metaphysics and epistemology, all in support of the idea that philosophers should rule, in support of the idea that the reason philosophers should rule is that many individuals are imprisoned by the senses and aren't able to reach the true nature of reality through the intellect. Book 7 closes with Plato's final thoughts about the education of the guardians. So what we see up here is a 7-stage educational regimen. The first stage, we got some of this in books 2 and 3. We get also towards the end of book 7 is that you get training not only in music and gymnastics, but arithmetic, plain and solid geometry, astronomy, and harmonics. Now, the next stage is 2 to 3 years of physical training, 2 to 3 years of gymnastics. So you could think of the first and the second stage as happening the first 20 years of an individual's life. So it's, corresponding to the way we think of, elementary school, then on to secondary school and post-secondary school. The third step is interesting. It's a 10-year training, a synoptic study of all subjects, so that you've acquired all this knowledge, and now you're going to see how all this knowledge fits. You're looking for how it all coheres together, to see how one thing leads to another. So Plato says here, this is reading from 537c. He says, and after that, from the age of 20, those who are chosen will also receive more honors than the others. Moreover, the subjects they learned in no particular order as children, they must now bring together to form a unified vision of their kinship, both with one another and with the nature of that which is. This continues then to the fourth stage, which is an introduction to dialectic. So Plato here says, and after that they have reached their 30th year, you'll select them in turn from among those chosen earlier and assign them yet greater honor. So this is a progressive educational scheme that is there are all these tests that are, that you think that the very cream of the crop are rising, to the top. Then you'll have to test them by means of the power of the dialectic to discover which of them can relinquish his eyes and other senses, going on with the help of truth to that which is by itself. So this is training in the power of philosophy to move beyond visible objects to the realm of the forms. And this is a task that requires great care. And so the question is, well, why does it require great care? Socrates says, don't you realize what great evil comes from dialectic as it is currently practiced? What evil is that? Those who practice it are filled with lawlessness. So this is a really interesting remark, because here Plato seems to be agreeing with the Athenians' criticism of Socrates, that Socrates, by practicing the power of dialectic, is corrupting the youth. Plato here seems to have the view that dialectic is a very powerful tool to uncover the nature of reality, to uncover hidden assumptions, and that it shouldn't be practiced by everyone. It should be reserved for the very best. Interesting remark. So guys, you should just be grateful, right, for philosophical training while you're in college, because according to Plato, this shouldn't happen until you're well within middle age. So the next stage of the dialectic is military and civic service for 15 years. So these individuals are gaining knowledge of, how political power is practiced. Let's read about this final step. This is 540 A through C. So then, Plato says, notice how old the guardians are when the ones that rise to the cream of the crop are enabled to be brought to the vision of the good. Then, at age 50, those who survive the test and have been successful both in practical matters and the sciences must be led to the goal and compelled to lift up the radiant light of their souls to what itself provides light for everything. And once they've seen the good itself, they must each in turn put the city, its citizens, and themselves in order, using it as their model. Each of them will spend most of his time with philosophy, but when his turn comes, he must labor in politics and rule for the sake of the city, not as if he were doing something fine, but rather something that has to be done. Then, having educated others like himself to take his place as guardians of the city, he will depart for the Isle of the Blessed and dwell there. So, this is really fascinating that Plato thinks that once you're brought to a vision of the good, you will not want to return to practical affairs. But Plato thinks that these guardians are obligated to use their new knowledge of the form of the good to govern, right, the city. Now, one of the things I think that is most fascinating about this is that Plato's thinking that with the form of the good, you acquire ideal knowledge of reality. So remember, his approach is that a person who acquires this knowledge is going to be able to see what the highest good is and see how everything fits together. So they have this massive synoptic vision of reality. It's coherent, it's systematic, fits together, and on the basis of that, a person is going to rule the ideal city. So we could sort of step back and say, wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't it be amazing if we had virtuous, knowledgeable rulers that knew what was the good and could sit back and organize society around that good? Okay, so now we're on to the last 3 books of the Republic. So we will finish the Republic this week. So I hope you're enjoying this. It's a fascinating topic, fascinating discussion.